Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to finish up putting the HengGuan P407 body together. Last time we finished by putting the front panel together in step 19, so let's get on with step 20. We will be needing the side mirror housings along with the mirror inserts, the windows, two M3 plain nuts, two 2x8 self-tappers, two 2.3x6 washer head self-tappers, and we'll also need 4 M3x6s. But rather than the silver ones that come with the kit, I'm going to swap them for some rather nice dome-headed black ones. They're still going to fit neatly in the recesses, but should look a little bit better than the silver ones. The front panel neatly slots into the front of the cab with a little bit of a jiggle. It's not a perfect fit, but it's close. We're going to need to pull the panel into position while we tighten the screws. First though, we're going to go around and loosely install all the M3 screws and nuts. The bottom ones need the nuts, and the other two screws attach the angle bracket to the cab. When tightening them up, we need to make sure that the panel is in just the right spot, then nip up the screws. They don't need to be super tight, as all they're doing is stopping the bracket from moving. Next, we pinch the corners and nip up the screws and nuts on the bottom edge. A little bit of thread lock might be a good idea with these ones, just be careful not to get any on the plastic. There's two more screws that need to get tightened, but I only noticed them after fitting all the other bits, so we'll come back to those in a minute. The window moulding is a perfect fit, and I must say it's one of the nicest window mouldings outside of a proper Tamiya one. There's no waviness or unevenness at all. I should imagine it would be quite a good replacement for an original Bruiser if you can find it as a spare part. All we do to fit it is drop it in and install the two washer head screws in the posts at the back of the cab. The front doesn't get attached until the interior goes in. Next up are the side mirrors. Now unfortunately they don't just clip together, so we're going to have to use some glue. I'm going to use some poly cement. It's going to stick well enough without removing the chrome, and this Humbrol stuff comes with a nice fine tip, so we can easily run a thin bead around just inside the edge. In the edit, this will be one smooth transition to fitting them, but in reality I let them sit for 15 minutes or so for the glue to really grab, so the mirrors aren't going to fall out while they're being handled. Fitting them is quite simple. We just pop one of the 2x8 self-tappers through the hole in the door and screw it into the mirror. It's a little bit awkward, but it's nothing like as bad as fitting those running lights in the last video. Something to keep in mind, these mirrors are going to be very vulnerable when they get caught in vegetation and during rollovers. To help them out a bit, it's not a bad idea to only do the screws up just enough that there's just enough friction to keep them upright. That way, when they get knocked, they should spin around quite easily. That just leaves nipping up the last two screws on the front panel. We need to press the front of the bonnet into the panel while we tighten them, otherwise there's going to be quite a big gap. It works out in the end though, and when it's all together, it does look really rather smart. Step 21, the cab extension bit, or as HG put it, the rear body. Out of the box, the cab extension and louvers were chrome, so like the bumper, I soaked them in some glow fuel and scrubbed most of it off and painted them. Interestingly, the louvers were moulded in a bright orange plastic. As well as those bits, we're also going to need the two mounts, F2 and F3. For screws, we've got two 2.3x4x8 washer head self-tappers. It's probably worth noting that they don't look anything like the little diagram. Four 2.3x6x6 washer head self-tappers and four 3x8 self-tappers. The mounts sit on the end of the cab extension. Now it's quite easy to figure out which one goes where. If the bottom edge doesn't sit straight, you've got the wrong one. They get attached with the four washer head screws with the small washer. They only need to be snug, just enough to grip the plastic. Remember, everything's quite soft, so there won't be much warning if you're about to strip the thread in the posts. Next, the louver slots into the rear face and gets attached with the last two washer head screws. Rather annoyingly, the cab extension was a little bit warped, so it doesn't quite sit right. It'll do the job, but it's still a bit of a shame. But still, it's a fairly cheap knockoff kit, and it's the only part so far that's not really been up to spec. The last job then is to attach the assembly to the bed using the four 3x8 self-tappers. This is another time where it's best to install the screws loosely and then nip them all up later. It makes it a lot easier to line up the screws with the holes when you can still manoeuvre things. Step 22, joining up the body parts. This time we need 2 M3 plain nuts, 4 3x8 self-tappers, and we're also going to need 3 M3x6 screws, but we're going to be swapping them and the self-tappers out for some nice black screws instead. I've got some M3x8 cap heads that will do nicely to mount the sill protectors. The heads fit neatly into the recesses, so all we need to do is offer up the protector and do up the screws. Now I've left them chrome for now, but I'm not sure if they should really be black like the front bumper on the body, or if they should be white like the chassis mounted bumpers. I'm leaning more towards white, I think, as that will also match the cab extension and maybe bring the whole lot together. To start joining up the body bits, we'll attach the lug on the cab extension to the roof of the cab using an M3x6 screw. For now we'll just leave it slightly loose, just so it keeps things in roughly the right position. Now we can install an M3x6 cap head in the bottommost hole. It should go through the cab and through the flange on the bed and have a nut on the inside. For now we'll just do them up so they're snug, but so we can still slide the body parts around just a little bit so we can align everything for the last 2 screws in the next step. That just leaves nipping up the top screw. Once the interior goes in, it's not going to be accessible, so we need to tighten it now. It only needs to be tight enough to grip the plastic. There's really no need to go silly. Step 23, the interior. We've got the steering wheel, the column, and the bench seat, painted in a rather fetching shade of brown. For the screws, we've got 2 M3x10s and 3 M3x6s. Again, I'm going to substitute the kit ones for some nice black ones to keep the theme going. And that just leaves a pair of M3 plain nuts. First, the column needs to get pressed into the back of the dashboard. Now it might need a bit of fiddling to get the wheel at just the right angle, so I'm not going to glue anything yet. Ultimately, a couple of spots of glue might be a good idea, just to make sure it doesn't move later. On the end of the column we can just press the wheel into position. Again, no glue, so we can move it later. The interior then just slides into the cab. Now you might need to bend the sides a little bit to get it in, just don't force it. Along the front edge we need the 3 M3x6s. For now they only need to be done up enough to locate the interior. We still want to be able to move it around a bit so we can line up the screws at the back. Now it turns out that the M3x10 screws only just reach from the outside of the body to the side of the seats. Now we can bend things to force it to work, but it's a lot of fiddling around. It's going to be much easier just to use some longer screws and use the nuts to pull things into position. I'm using, I think, M3x20s here, which made life so much easier. With them in and nipped up, we can go around all the screws that we left loose and tighten them up. Remembering that most of the machine screws are going straight into plastic, so we need to watch the tightness. And of course, those 2 bottom screws with the nuts will probably want a bit of thread lock on them too. Step 24 and 25 is just adding some final touches. We got the windscreen wipers, which would just pop into the holes on the front of the windscreen, although they're a bit tight, so they would need some careful drilling out, along with a bit of poly cement to keep them in. But we'll do that later, once we've got all the rest of the interior sorted out. If we needed to remove the windscreen, they're going to be a bit vulnerable. For the decals, I'm a fan of keeping it all to a minimum, so we will use the windows for the cab extension, the side stripes, and the little 4-wheel drive logos on the wings. Now, I'm tempted to use the Toyota text on the tailgate too, but I think I'd rather it was in black, so I might have to have a think about that. With the decals applied, we've finished the build manual, and that's about as far as we can go until more of the bits and bobs turn up. Now, to get a better feel for how it looks, I think we need to take it outside. We're still waiting on the steering servo and receiver, so we can't actually drive it yet, but we're definitely on the home stretch, and I think it's looking pretty good. So, until next time then, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if you got something to say. Bye guys!